حني قلبي على جمعة الخير هلا حني قلبي على جمعة الخير هلا يا هلا ويا هلا ويا هلا ويا هلا يا هلا ويا هلا ويا
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another edition of Let's Talk with me, Julie Alli. On the show today, we're going to talk climate change. We also look at the final days of Ramadan, the spirit of Ramadan with Brother Ziad Dadabai. But first up, we talk to senior clinical psychologist about EQ and IQ, the importance of EQ, and how do you recognize that your child is emotionally intelligent. But if your child doesn't display signs of being emotionally intelligent, is there anything you can do to enhance this sixth sense? So I believe that is what it is. We have our five senses, and the sixth one is emotional intelligence. Let's speak with the expert. Her name is Jody de Rook. She is a senior clinical psychologist and she has a practice in Four Ways, Johannesburg. Morning, Jody. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Julie. Hi.
EQ, I believe people are kind of touting it as the next best big thing. The new gold, liquid gold, call it what you like. But people are saying this is what you invest in as far as you as a human being is concerned, and very especially if you're a parent and you have a child. If you want your child to have absolutely the best chance in life, you need to make sure that your child is emotionally intelligent. So what is emotional intelligence? Are you not just naturally born with it? I referred to the five senses in my introduction, and I've also suggested that the sixth sense is obviously emotional intelligence. What is it?
So emotional intelligence is really being able to use your heart. So traditionally, we very much in society have sort of emphasized just using our brain, just using our logic and our rationale. But the new research and with neuroscience and everything coming out is showing that our emotions serve an incredibly important function, and they're part of us. They're part of what makes us tick, and they are incredibly important in terms of making decisions, in terms of how we function. I know Harvard Business Review has recently said that kind of 76% of your success is dependent on having a high emotional intelligence, and it's being able to know what your emotions are and then use them in a way that really helps you to be effective. So they say somebody, for example, like Steve Jobs, was just really successful at being able to figure out what is he feeling and what are other people feeling and how does he kind of work with that. And that accounts for a lot of his success.
Mm-hmm. The world is truly at a loss with his passing, isn't it?
Yes.
Anyway, my sympathies to his family, even though it's years on. When we talk emotional intelligence, I'm kind of thinking if you're trying to grasp the concept, I'm thinking, the sense of sight, smell, etc., hear, etc., taste. This is a crucial one as well. How do you explain it in the grown-up world? I'm thinking about your diplomats. A lot of people, you have two classes of people. You have the very forthright, straightforward people, those that shoot from the hip, that want to say it as it is or even worse. And then you have your people that are very diplomatic in how they go about engaging and expressing themselves. Would that diplomatic person be someone who is emotionally intelligent?
Yes, that is one aspect of emotional intelligence. So they're kind of three main aspects. The first one is in awareness. Somebody who's aware, how do I feel? Many people that I deal with, they don't know how they're feeling. And that can be, quite sort of dangerous. If you don't know that you're getting angry, you might suddenly lose your temper. Or if you don't realize you're jealous, you might act out. So that one aspect is kind of just being aware. Then the other aspect is kind of what you're referring to there is regulation. Kind of being able to say, okay, so I'm jealous. How should I behave? I'm cross with this person. How can I discipline myself?
But does that not mean you're in a mode of pretense while you're interacting with that person? So I'm jealous, I'm angry because you did or said something. How do I go about regulating my behavior and interacting with you without being being true to myself?
Yes. So it's something, for example, as a therapist, sometimes you might be working with a client and you might have a certain bias, and sometimes to own it, to notice, I've got that bias, and to sort of say, wow, you're intimidating me a little bit. It's actually, I've regulated it. I'm not acting out on it. I'm not just behaving and kind of doing whatever I would do when I'm intimidated. I'm actually owning it, giving it a name so that we can both be aware it's there in the room. So I'm still being authentic, if that makes sense. But then it helps instead of acting out on it, instead of maybe you try and put the person down, or maybe you try and build yourself up. You named it, and it kind of releases the pressure of it, and you can move on.
Is that when you kind of almost have closure on the issue?
Yes.
So to speak. Because if you don't talk about it, and if you tiptoe around it all the time, whether it's your interaction with an adult or with a child, it's oftentimes the unsaid stuff that creates more of the drama or the angst or the anger, etc.
Absolutely, totally. And I think that's the same with parenting. Very often we're telling our children, be quiet, don't feel that, get over it. And we're not actually training them. How do I deal with it when we do that? This is the emotion, name it, and now what are my options to deal with it? Rather than, and I did see that a lot, Julie, I do sort of emotional intelligence assessments. And South Africans in general tend to not navigate our emotions. We tend to suppress and pretend they're not there, or we pretend to just act out and let go, or we flick between the two.
Is it a unique situation with us South Africans?
I don't know if it's a unique situation, but it's something that the assessments are we're actually part of the Arabic and African community that we are normed against, and we're normed quite low.
Ooh.
So
as far as emotional intelligence is concerned?
Not as far as but as far as navigating emotions, as far as actually naming an emotion, owning an emotion, and then figuring out what we want to do with it. We tend to suppress, or we tend to act out. And I mean, that could be part of our political selves, it could be part of our cultural selves, but it's definitely an area we have to grow in and model to our children, and also then help them grow in. I think, a lot of our culture is very much, emotions are not important, they're not the big deal. And actually, they're very good information. And if you think of, if you marry somebody, if you leave a job, if you make a friend, you very seldom are just doing that on your rationale. It's your emotions that are involved as well.
It's about how you feel.
So those big life decisions are about how you feel. And so the more that you can navigate and sort of understand, how am I feeling, the more effective you can be in connecting, in making those big life decisions.
So Jody, I've alluded a couple of times to the 5 senses. We are naturally born with them. Experts like yourselves are telling us also that the 6th sense is now the emotional intelligence. Are we born with it? Or is it something you kind of work on, almost consciously work on it, or is it here and it just comes naturally?
Julie, I think that's a good question. I think that you're talking about it as the 6th sense, and I think it's both. I think that some people are naturally, just like some people are born with a higher IQ, some people are born with a higher EQ for whatever reason. Maybe it's just their personality style, maybe it's kind of ancestral, I'm not sure, genetic or through the generations. But the good thing about emotional intelligence is that anybody can grow. So if you anybody can grow in any aspect. You can become more aware of your emotions, or you can learn how to navigate them more, or you can become more optimistic, or you can...
It's a conscious decision on your part.
Totally.
Let's go for an ad break. When we come back, I want to hone in on our children, our toddlers, and how is it that we as parents help them hone that sixth sense of theirs, which is emotional intelligence. I'm talking to senior clinical psychologist. Her name is Julie Alli. She's based in Fourways, Johannesburg, and we're talking emotional intelligence. Is it something that you can cultivate in your children? Is it something you can help them come to grasp with? Is it a doable thing? We'll talk more about this right after the ad break. We're talking about helping parents raise emotionally intelligent children, because that is supposed to be the big thing in this century. Julie Alli, who is a senior clinical psychologist, is going to help us unpack that concept. Is it doable? How do I as a parent know that my child is lacking emotionally intelligently, or he or she is a superstar in that area of their lives?
Normally you're able to tell, are they doing the age appropriate things? Are they able to pay attention? Are they able to sort of regulate themselves? When they're upset, can they find a way through? When they're frustrated, can they make a plan? Do they sort of have problem solving? So are they appropriate? And often you'll find a teacher or somebody will give feedback, the preschool teacher, whatever, to say, your child just is really interacting well. He shows a lot of empathy, or she shows a lot of empathy. She seems to be aware of other children. So then you know your child's a bit of a superstar. If your child is spinning out and not be able to do that, then you've got to get in there and help them a little bit.
So the word you use, Jody, is regulate, and I think this can be applied to children and adults as well. People who have temper tantrums or a rage or a meltdown, whatever it is that you refer to it as, in this day and age. How do you help that person? Let's assume they don't have the tools or the understanding or the insight to regulate, to self-regulate, to get out of this very bad space that they're in, which indicates that they're not emotionally intelligent. Can you help them regulate?
Yes, absolutely. So, for example, Julie, if you have a young toddler who's maybe frustrated, first of all, by you modeling, when you're frustrated, you say to your child, sure, that was frustrating, but I just kept myself calm and I put my head down and I just took it step by step. So they can learn it from hearing that. Secondly, it's by sort of saying to the child, wow, you are so angry. You are just screaming and screaming and screaming. And I wonder what result you're going to get from that. And what are the options? What could you do? You could behave like this, or you could behave like that.
Will they hear you? Will they respond to you? I'm talking a 3 or a 4-year-old child.
They often would. What I've found is a phenomenal thing is we want to be seen. All of us, we want to be seen. We want to be witnessed. So if you say to a child, wow, you are so angry, you're just screaming and screaming and screaming and beating your fists, they'll often be, yay, I'm seen. And they'll often give pause.
Walking away from a child or an adult having a meltdown, does that do any good? Or have you not acknowledged them and it just frustrates them further?
Usually it just frustrates them further. So the best thing is to acknowledge. Sometimes, if somebody is just hysterical, you need to put them in a timeout. If it's a toddler, you say, you're going to need to be in a I hear you, I see you. You're going to need to calm yourself down in a timeout, and then we're going to figure out what to do. So, you do, or you have to physically pick them up and hold them and just say, I hear your anger. So, sometimes if they're really on their way, you do have to do more to calm them down. But usually ignoring the emotion, they ratchet up.
Okay. Let's assume your child doesn't display emotional intelligence. Are there exercises or anything you as a parent can do to try and up that sixth sense of theirs, and what would it be?
There are hundreds and hundreds of exercises, and they're all in sort of, emotional intelligence. We've mentioned sort of the awareness, the regulation. There's also self-management. There's a whole lot of different areas. So a child could be highly intelligent in terms of empathy. They really can feel for others, but quite low in intelligence in terms of being optimistic in emotional intelligence. So there's different areas. There are hundreds of exercises, even now on the internet, that you can Google and practice with your child. But lots of things, if it's empathy, when you're reading a story, help that child empathize. Yeah, empathy is actually supposed to be one of the skills that this century is getting lower and lower on, because people are quite entitled and quite aware of themselves and not others. So reading a story, looking at a movie and thinking, I wonder what they felt. What must it have been like? What would you feel if that happened? So that you develop that skill of empathy. Optimism is not always about being positive. Optimism is sometimes, it's about problem solving. It's about, I hit an obstacle and I can find a way over, under, around, through. So it's often having that kind of, this isn't the end. I can keep trying to resolve this. And so you can talk about that with your kids. If there's a certain situation, how do we fix it? How do we resolve it? What are the options?
You talked about two things that I want to hook into as far as emotional intelligence is concerned. And I'm talking across the board, not only children, I'm talking adults as well. Optimism, people seem to think we misunderstand what optimism is all about. We kind of think if you're optimistic, you got to look at the glass that's half full rather than half empty. But you've just highlighted something which I'd never given thought to. It's about problem solving, and you'd feel good about it. You may not get the best result that you've been looking for, but you're going to get some result that's going to make you feel good.
Absolutely, Julie, because I think what, sometimes people think of this optimism as this fake, everything's wonderful, and it's not. It's saying, you know what, I can find a way through this. I can either find a way to live with it, or I can find a way to fix it, make some progress with it. And that's really optimism. And that's one of the most fundamental skills of emotional intelligence.
When we look at children with temper tantrums and adults that have meltdowns as well, with certain people, they'll have their meltdown and be very remorseful about the issue afterwards. Does that not indicate some level of emotional intelligence? And how can you then hook in to make them aware that the fact that you are very remorseful indicates that you can, and there is some amount of control. So what is it that you tell them to try and prevent getting to that point, the meltdown point?
I do think that that anger, every emotion is giving you information. So anger is giving you information either that I'm frustrated, I can't get something I want, or you've built up so much hurt that it's just exploding. And so I do think talking to somebody and kind of helping them to see what is it you want and how could you go about getting it. Because anger, those kind of rages and anger is actually quite a powerless reaction. It's when you feel powerless. So what are you feeling powerless against? And how else can you tackle it? But obviously you can't do that while they're in the rage.
And yet the person who's having the rage seems to think that they're in a position of power and control because you're being intimidated by their bad behavior. And yet it's quite the opposite.
It's quite the opposite. Somebody who has to yell and scream and try to intimidate, if I'm feeling powerful, I don't have to do that. It's when I'm feeling I can't get through, I can't get my way, I can't get what I want, that I have to try to up my power. And people actually are subconsciously reading, this person's out of control, this person's not very powerful.
Absolutely. Children, a 4-year-old, for example, having these repeated temper tantrums, not in contact with their emotions whatsoever. What's the language we use with them? A lot of parents would say to them, it's time out, or 5 minutes in front, facing the wall, or whatever the case may be, or no sweeties for you this weekend, no treats for you. what's the best way to navigate around this? And once the child has calmed down, what do you leave the child with? Not too much information, obviously they're not going to process, but what sort of information do you give them to hopefully for them to reflect on?
I don't think it's a bad idea for a timeout or something like that, because sometimes that, they need an external regulator to calm down. But then I think when you're talking it through with them, to look at them and say, okay, did that get you what you wanted? Did you screaming and hitting and behaving badly get you what you wanted? And then to help them see what would get you what you wanted. What are your other options? Because remember, it's that frustrated, I want something I can't get. So what are the other options? What else could you do? Could you say, Mommy, please, can I have a sweetie? It's really important to me. Would you get it more then than if you lost your temper?
And oftentimes people that have these rages, just for peace sake, people either give in at that point, at the height of the rage, or walk away.
Yeah.
And it doesn't help the situation whatsoever.
No, not at all. I mean, the one is actually reinforcing, giving them the thing at the height of it is actually reinforcing their behavior, and walking away. Usually, because the person is already feeling powerless and frustrated, they try to get more power, and they explode more in their frustration. Mm-hmm. So it really is about validating. This is how I see you feel. I see you are hugely, hugely angry, and you are grappling with your emotions. What can we do about it? What is really going on for you?
Is that not going to push them further into the rage?
Usually not. Mm-hmm. Usually not. I mean, I think if you've been in an interaction with somebody and they have felt unheard and have felt powerless for a long time, they might ricochet up the first 2 or 3 times you do that. But as they see you really engaging, they'll calm down.
With 2 minutes to wrap up, let's summarize what we've talked about and the take-home message to all our rages, the little ones and the adults as well.
I think the important thing is just that we're all aware of our emotional intelligence, aware of our emotions, aware of how we utilize in them, and then helping our children to utilize it and validating. I think even with those rages, having them validate themselves. I am so frustrated about something, and us also acknowledging each other's emotions, and then thinking of more useful ways to get what we want or to express them, and helping each other to do that, especially with parents.
That's where we leave it. I do hope we're going to see you sometime soon again to talk about other issues, other psychological issues, obviously. And I've just spoken to you off air to say that perhaps you need to come in and talk to us about borderline personality disorder and possibly anger management as well.
Thank you.
In a later program. Thank you indeed. I thoroughly enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you, Julie.
That was senior clinical psychologist Jody de Rook. She's based in Four Ways, Johannesburg, and she spoke to us this morning about emotional intelligence. Still to come, the spirit of Ramadan with Ziad Dadabai, and later on, 350.org, they're here to talk climate change.
Next issue.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the program. We are in the final days of Ramadan. It is the 1st of June. Alhamdulillah, we thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His mercy in allowing us to be here and sharing this Mubarak month with our loved ones. In studio, I have a very special guest, and I say special because Alhamdulillah, he has joined me last year as well to talk about spiritual matters. He's here again all the way from Roshni to talk about the spirit of Ramadan. And I know it is the final days of Ramadan. So while we're talking spirit of Ramadan, why is it important? Well, let's speak to Ziad and hear what he has to say. Assalamu alaikum to you, Ziad. Welcome to the show. What I do also want to say, which was supposed to have been part of my intro, is that it's the final days of Ramadan. We do know that our brothers and sisters are sitting in itikaf. Yes, sisters too, even though, they make a niyat for a shorter period. But we do sit in itikaf to derive the benefits from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And more importantly, alhamdulillah, we all hope and pray and we beg Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us with the mercies of Laylatul Qadr.
Yeah, inshallah. Alhamdulillah, Allah bless us all with the
Ameen,
spirit of
ameen.
Laylatul Qadr.
And that is all part of the spirit of Ramadan.
It's all part of this. Ramadan has many dimensions. It's a financial dimension, a social dimension, but what's important for us is the spiritual dimension. And what it is we should exit Ramadan with. Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala legislate this month for us? So if we look at the Quran, Allah says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, O you who believe, kutiba alaykumus siyamu, fasting has been prescribed upon you, kama kutiba ala alladhina min qablikum, like it was prescribed for those upon you, la'allakum tattaqun, in order that you get this component called taqwa. Now, Ibn al-Qayyim, one of the great scholars of Islam, he says, if a person fasts, or if he gives Ramadan its due, then he will be able to extract this treasure from Ramadan called taqwa. Now, generally, if you say to anyone, well, what's taqwa? They say it's the fear of Allah.
And it's more God consciousness, the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Yes, so taqwa comes from the word wiqaya, which means to protect yourself. And in essence, you're saying, I want to protect myself with the reminder, with the consciousness of Allah from the evils that I find in my surroundings. Now, if you just have to take a human being, if we look at Imam Ghazali, for example, he says if you want to understand your relationship with your soul, it's like a rider and his horse. They're on a journey, and the object of their journey is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The rider is to make sure that the horse stays disciplined and stays on the path. If either of the two become unruly or they lose sight of the objective, they both perish. So the way to stay on this path is by keeping your gaze on the objective. There's a famous racing car driver, Mario Andretti, one of the most successful Formula One drivers, and they asked him, can you give us from all your years of driving one piece of advice? He says, always keep your eye on the road because the car goes where your eyes go. So the important thing for us is that taqwa is keeping your eye on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in everything. So Imam Ghazali, he says that the spiritual heart, its job is to find the meaning and the wisdom and the blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in everything. And the physical eye, it sees forms. So another great scholar, Ibn Arabi, for those that watch Ep31, he's a Sheikh, Ibn Arabi.
Sure.
Ibn Arabi says that Allah created the spirit specially to manifest His attributes. So for example, Allah manifests His attributes of forgiveness through the heart of the believer when He forgives, or kindness when He shows kindness, or generosity when He shows generosity. And these are all the qualities of Ramadan. So he says, the human spirit has been designed to reflect these qualities, these attributes of Allah, and the physical body has to manifest that in the world. Okay.
Post Ramadan, alhamdulillah, I think we all as Muslims really look forward to this month of Ramadan.
Okay.
We embrace it wholeheartedly. We are at our best behavior ever in the month of Ramadan, and we all want Allah's blessings and mercy. Sad to say, when Ramadan is over, we have this big feast on Eid Day. And I also want to touch on, the ibadah of the women of the household that prepare these feasts. Sometimes we also seem to think that they're wasting time on preparing for their loved ones. But that too is an ibadah, and I'll leave you to expand on that. But then post-Ramadan, myself included, we try to be on our best behavior in Ramadan, but post-Ramadan, we seem to lag back into our old habits, our bad habits. What is it that we're doing wrong? What is it that we ought to be doing to take a few of the mercies and the blessings of Ramadan into our everyday life?
Well, that's a beautiful question, because in developing this component called taqwa, what we're actually training ourselves is to look for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in every situation. So let me give you an example. Say a husband comes home now in the Ramadan, and his wife has prepared for him, and he looks at the table. If he looks with his physical eyes, he may say to her, but you only made 2 savories. Is that all? I'm working all day.
Right.
But if he's looking with the spiritual eye,
Right.
first of all, what does he see? He first sees Allah. So he says, Alhamdulillah, I have the food. Alhamdulillah, I have a wife that prepared the food. Alhamdulillah, I have a family to share the food with.
Alhamdulillah.
So all of a sudden, as he starts to see Allah, his whole experience changes. He starts to live in the present, because we only enjoy the present. So let's look at an example. Let's say your neighbor brings you some dates. If you're looking with the spiritual heart, you say, Alhamdulillah, this is a gift from Allah, and He chose this neighbor to send it to me. I'm so grateful. If you're looking with the physical eye, you may say, but this is dates from Southwest Africa. How dare she send me these dates?
Right.
And like this, when we start to look, you can look at your car, for example, and you can say, Alhamdulillah, this is a blessing from Allah. Or you look with the physical eye, and then you say, this car is not good enough for me.
Because our egos, we allow our nafs to overtake.
So,
but then
yes.
Post-Ramadan, where does this discussion take us?
This is what I'm saying. So the purpose of Ramadan is to develop this consciousness in you. So when we exit Ramadan, we're continuing to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first before we see everything else. So when you put your clothing on,
Alhamdulillah.
so the first thing, this is a gift from Allah. If you're seeing with the physical eye, this garment is old, I need to change it. So what happens is, when we start to develop this sense of taqwa, when we see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first, we become more appreciative. We become more positive. We become more compassionate. We start to live in the moment. Because when you look at life today, we're being robbed of the present with social media. So the first thing that happens after Ramadan is that we're bombarded by all the things we
still are, even in the month of Ramadan.
Even in the month of Ramadan. And what it's doing is all of these things are designed to shift the focus.
Right.
And so Ramadan is saying, shift your focus to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when you exit Ramadan, you have to exit with that focus. And so the result of the focus is beauty in your actions. And so if anyone wants to analyze their Ramadan, they have to see the way they exit the month of Ramadan, whether it's improved the way they behave. But just coming back to the mothers, when the mother is preparing the food, because this was the question you asked, and they're preparing it with this understanding in their minds that I'm doing this to please Allah and to provide for my family, that preparation with this consciousness, it becomes an ibadah. So every mundane activity, if we keep the consciousness of Allah in the back of our mind, it becomes an act of ibadah.
Inshallah. Let's go for an ad break. When we come back, I want to focus a little bit on Laylatul Qadr and the day of Eid, inshallah. I'm talking to Brother Ziad Dadaba. He's come all the way from Roshni Vereniging to join us on the program to talk about the spirit of Ramadan. And I think from now on, whenever I mention the word Alhamdulillah, I will think of Brother Ziad, because he has explained to me in another show about the attitude of gratitude and the word Alhamdulillah, the first word when you open up the Holy Quran. And with a heavy heart and much gratitude, Alhamdulillah, we've come almost to the end of Ramadan. In 5 days' time, approximately, we will be celebrating the end of Ramadan and the feast of Eid. What lessons do we take out of this? We're going to speak to Brother Ziad Dadaba. Is it right that after having fasted the entire month of Ramadan, that we feast on the day of Eid? What do we learn from that? And let's also touch on the wondrous day, or rather the night, which is better than 1,000 months. Yes, I'm talking Laylatul Qadr. Over to you.
Okay, so just to wrap up what we said in the previous, Ramadan, first of all, is a gift for the believer, for his own well-being. It cures us and it heals us physically. We know the medical benefits.
Allah gives us a chance to renew, revive,
yes,
to inculcate good habits.
Yes, so it can benefit us when we exit for the balance of the 11 months. So physically it benefits us, and spiritually it benefits us. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't leave us there. In addition to that, He gives us the opportunity to gain the special light from Him. So this is His mercy and His forgiveness and the protection from the hellfire. And this is one of the gifts of the Laylatul Qadr, the night of power or the night of destiny, which is the root word of the word Qadr. And we know from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that the Sahaba complained to the Prophet ﷺ that there were people before us that lived for so many years and worshipped so much longer. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then gave this ummah the blessing of Laylatul Qadr. Now, we have to understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that desires all good for us.
True.
And He gives this human being one opportunity each year in order to try and petition Him for whatever their needs are. And this is that night, Laylatul Qadr. The Prophet ﷺ, he says, the closest a servant is to his master is when he's in 2 raka'ah of prayer and he's in sujood. So he says, فَأَكْثِرُ دُعَائِكَ. So increase your dua, your supplication to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is what Laylatul Qadr is. First of all, it's a night in which we can remove all the harms that we've gathered over a lifetime. And then we can make an investment for the akhirah. But in addition to that, it's a night where we can find the solutions for all the current problems we're facing with. This is part of the beauty of Ramadan, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is opening His treasure stores and saying, well, who wants to come? All of you just come, and this is the beauty of Laylatul Qadr.
And even if your issues, your problems are not resolved, at least Allah will just lighten your burden and be able to give you the peace that you're striving for, to give you a clear head, an understanding, some sort of direction by way of a dream or by way of reading a passage in the Holy Quran. I often say when I'm troubled, I open the Quran randomly and the first verse that my eye falls on, for me, that is my answer from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Well, this is it, right? So like I said to Imam Ghazali, says that the spiritual heart, it sees meanings. And literally the Quran is all the meanings that your spiritual heart needs to give or to interpret everything you are currently experiencing. Mm-hmm. So if someone's in difficulty, the Quran is giving him the meanings of patience. Because through the patience, he learns to deal with the difficulty. And Ibn al-Qayyim, one of our great scholars, he says that difficulties that lead to a remembrance are better than blessings that lead to forgetfulness. So often we don't understand the wisdoms. But when we petition Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Ramadan, He will definitely, apart from just pacifying us, we must believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make the way out for us. But not according to the way we want,
exactly,
but according to the way He chooses and according to the way He knows is good for us.
Absolutely. So the outcome may not be what you want, as you say, but just accept that whatever does happen is by the will and the betterment for you through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Yes.
A lot of people do suffer a lot of difficulties in all areas of their lives. And this is the month. We make ibadah all the time. We always put our hands up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide us. But this is that special time of the year when Allah does give you guidance. He does show you the way. You do get direction. The answers are within yourself through the Spirit of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And things may not necessarily go well or smoothly in people's lives. In the month of Ramadan, if you're faced with a lot of calamity, what's the best thing to do? Is it just to sit on that musalla and raise your hands?
The most powerful thing is the dua. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ud'uni astajib lakum. You should ask me and I will respond to you. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that if you going through tribulation, He says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu sta'inu bis sabri was salah. You should seek the help of Allah with patience and with prayer. And now, importantly, Allah says, وَإِنَّهَا لَكَبِيرَةٌ إِلَّا عَلَى الْخَاشِعِينَ. But this is very difficult, except for those who have this special khushu', the special respect and awe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So most importantly in Ramadan is to make that dua even with the taqwa. Remember we said the presence of mind? Because the Prophet ﷺ, he says that Allah says, I don't pay attention to a dua that's made with an absent heart. Okay? Your heart must be present in the dua. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says, he says, Man la yas'alillah, the Prophet ﷺ said, Man la yas'alillah, whoever doesn't ask Allah, yaghtab alay, Allah is upset with him. So we're learning from these two hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that Allah wants you, He loves for you.
And He
to
wants
ask
you
him.
to ask. And He wants you to ask for forgiveness as well, because He is the most merciful, most forgiving.
So if we just look at the thing of forgiveness, right? When we do negative acts or we do sin, for example, we toxify our body. Asking for forgiveness has got a dual purpose. One is spiritually it cleanses us, but physically also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will remove the effects of those negative energies on the body. So again, when we come to the tawbah, it's good for us. There's something we must understand about this deen. You know, we understand Islam as a set of rules Allah gave us to do, and if we do it, then He pays us for it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us what's good for us. Every single thing legislated in this deen is what the body and the soul needs for its success.
And it may not be what we want, but through the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is the right thing and it is good for us. Even if we view it as negative at the point, it's that learning experience that we're going to go through that negative situation. And that is a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The day of Eid, the preparation, the all-out sumptuous feast that we have, the family get-togethers. After we've talked about the spirituality, the gift of Laylatul Qadr, the gift of the month of Ramadan, how do we marry the two, the day of Eid? I mean, you fasted the whole month. The women spend the last 3 or the last 5 days in preparation to put up this huge feast for the extended family.
Okay. So first of all, for the women, I want them to understand that if you do this preparation, first of all, with the right state of mind, it becomes something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we spoke about this before. The Prophet ﷺ says, Inna Allah kataba al-ihsana ala kulli shay. Allah has commanded ihsan, excellence in everything you do. So if you start to prepare that with this in mind, with the consciousness of Allah, and you do it excellently, it becomes an ibadah for you.
Don't look at it as a burden.
No.
It's an act of love.
So it's an act of love. Mm-hmm. And what I want us to understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in the Quran, He says, Inna Allah ma'alladhina taqaw. Now, ma'a in Arabic means with. So, Inna Allah ma'alladhina taqaw. Allah is with the people that are conscious of Him. Walladhina hum muhsinun. And those who bring beauty and excellence into their lives. So when you just prepare that meal with this consciousness and with this concept of taqwa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I'm with you. Now, if you want to understand the greatness of that gift, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent Musa alayhi salam to Fir'aun, so you can imagine he's going to the tyrant of the world at that time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to him, La takhafa, don't fear you two, you and your brother, innani ma'akuma, I am with you. Meaning, as long as I'm with you, even the greatest tyrant on the earth can't harm you. When the Prophet ﷺ and Sayyidina Abu Bakr, they were in the cave, and Sayyidina Abu Bakr was concerned, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, La tahzan, don't be fearful. Inna Allah ma'ana, Allah is with us. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is promising me and you. He's saying, look here, if you just come with this consciousness and infuse this beauty into anything you do, in the way you speak, in the way you dress, in the way you drive, in the way you deal with each other, I will be
with you.
So if you want to look for Ramadan, what a more beautiful gift to exit Ramadan than with the ma'iyah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with the companionship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And how do you do that? By just being conscious of Him and doing what's good for yourself. So when we come lastly to the day of Eid, for example, on the day of Eid for the men is to see the favor of Allah, that He blessed them with the day of Eid, but also to see the blessing in the women that He's given them, that has made this day possible. Let him see that if there was not the women there, what kind of an Eid
would they have had?
Because the other thing is...
Because women and family members often feel, or some women feel, a bit resentful. I could rather be reading Quran Sharif, or I could be making Nafil Salah, or making a special dua. Why do I have to be slaving in the kitchen to prepare this meal for the family? Almost being a bit resentful and feeling it's unfair, feeling that she could be involved in spiritual duties. But that preparation of the food is an ibadah.
It's almost the epitome of spirituality.
And you start in the name of Allah.
Yes.
You start with the remembrance of Allah and in gratitude, because you are so grateful for everything you see, that you've been blessed with all the beautiful foods, all the fresh food, the fact that you can afford to put this feast up for your family.
The fact that you have a family to prepare it for. So the husbands have to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the gift, and the wives have to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the gift. And we have to understand that the purpose of this journey is to reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Acts of worship are to reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but we can change every single act into an act of worship just with consciousness and the ihsan that we infuse into it.
And with a half a minute to go, what are we leaving our viewers with today, inshallah?
I just want to leave everyone with this message, that if you cleanse your heart, it has to become apparent on your actions.
Alhamdulillah.
And as we exit Ramadan, we have to make sure that this Ramadan was not wasted, and we have to manifest this beauty in our actions.
And even if you've gone through negative experiences in the month of Ramadan, look at the positivity and the beauty in those experiences. What have you learned? What are you taking out? And how do you become a stronger and a more Allah-conscious person, someone with taqwa?
Yes, and if you do that, you go to Jannah. The Prophet ﷺ, سُئِلَ رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عن أكثر ما يدخل الناس الجنة. The Prophet ﷺ was asked, what will enter most people into Jannah? He said, taqwa Allahi wa husnul khuluq. That you're conscious of Allah and you behave beautifully towards the people. And this is the last thing on the Eid day, behave beautifully with everyone. And in that, you can get opportunity to earn Allah's pleasure and get to Jannah, inshallah.
Inshallah, Jazakallah so much for that spiritual message, spiritually uplifting message. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept yours and all of our du'as in this Mubarak month of Ramadan. That was Brother Ziad Dadabai all the way from Roshni talking to us about spirituality in Ramadan. And I truly feel very uplifted. Alhamdulillah. May this beautiful feeling of spirituality emanate with us throughout the rest of the year, inshallah. We're going to now talk climate change with an organization called 350.org. Thank you for keeping me company. We started out talking emotional intelligence. We covered the spirituality of Ramadan. And now we're going to look at climate change with an organization called 350.org. Is it still relevant? We've been banging on about this for the past 10 years or more. Have people kind of taken their eye off the ball as far as climate change is concerned? Has enough been done about climate change? Well, we're going to talk to Alex Lenferner. He's from 350.org, and let's hear about the kind of work they're doing and if this is still an area of concern. Alex, good morning. Welcome to the program.
Morning, Julie. Thank you for having me, and Assalamu alaikum and Ramadan Mubarak to your viewers. Yeah.
Wa alaikum assalam. Jazakallah indeed for those well wishes. 350.org is all about climate change. You are an NGO or an NPO, I understand, and you wanting your voices to be heard. I also understand that you were very, very disappointed. We've just come out of the general elections and none of the political parties had even thought about raising the issue around climate change. I thought that we've kind of done and dusted with this issue.
Yeah, I think it wasn't so much that they didn't raise the issue. A number of them raised the issue in their manifestos and in their policy proposals, but it's a question of whether they are proposing action that is proportionate to the scale of the challenge that we face. So when you look at the science of climate change, it's telling us we need to move away from fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas quite rapidly. But if you look at the manifestos of the major parties, they're offering us very slow progress on climate change, and the speed at which they're offering us progress puts us on a pathway to pretty devastating climate change in the future if everybody followed that model. And so that's where the real disappointment comes in. Not that they're not speaking about it, but when they do, the vision that they're offering us is insufficient or inadequate to the scale of the crisis.
Some people might argue that perhaps there are more pressing issues to be addressed. Unemployment, education issue, the health system, the state of, the health system in the country. Where and how do you cut yourself up and try and focus on everything that's important enough and see that it gets the attention it needs? Right. And here you are talking about climate change. People kind of feel or don't really realize that the impact is already being felt with all of the natural disasters that we see happening around us. Would I be correct in thinking that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's two ways to respond to that concern. One is to say that we're already feeling the impacts. So, for instance, there was a study done the other day that showed that South Africa is 10 to 20% poorer as a result of the impact of climate change already. The GDP.
How so?
So when you look at natural disasters, the way that they impact on our economy, they destroy buildings, they impact communities negatively. You look at droughts, which impact our ability to produce food, and that in turn slows down our GDP, makes food more expensive. So it's a combination of these impacts on communities and our economy, which basically add up to really, really significant impacts that are occurring now and are set to get much worse if we don't take action. So that's one way of responding, is to say, well, actually climate change is affecting the economy, it is affecting our health, it is really affecting us already. But the other way to respond is to say that when we think about dealing with climate change, it's not just climate change in a silo. When we act on climate change, we can also improve health, we can also improve economic growth. So our biggest threat to our economy in South Africa is arguably Eskom, right? Because they're in a pile of debt, they're our biggest state-owned enterprise. And when we think about how do we dig Eskom out of the situation it is in right now, renewable energy provides the lowest cost energy future for South Africa, right? And so in terms of being able to pull Eskom out and move towards more affordable energy, renewable energy arguably has to be a major part of that mix, and that in turn also addresses the biggest contributor to climate change on the continent, which is Eskom.
So you talk renewable energy, I assume you're referring to solar energy.
Solar and wind and hydro.
Mm-hmm. The economists argue that the setup or startup costs of those are really very high, they're astronomical, and I'm just not sure that the ordinary working man in the street would be able to afford that type of energy at this point in time. It would pay for itself in 10 or 20 years' time, but right now the burden's going to be huge.
Yeah, it depends on where you're looking at. So in terms of large-scale power production, what we find is that it used to be the case that coal was the cheapest form of energy, but the cost of wind and solar have gone down so much in the last few years that actually solar and wind at that large-scale production is much cheaper to put in place and is saving us energy already relative to coal and gas. Now, when it comes to the individual trying to put solar on, let's say, their own house or so on, I think you're right. There are upfront costs that people face. And so it's typically only the richer individuals that can afford to put up that upfront capital. And then in the long run, they'll save money, right? So part of what we need to ask as policymakers, as citizens, is how do we put in place a model that allows lower income citizens to benefit from that? And there are ways of doing it. You can provide suitable financing models so that low-income folks don't have to have that huge upfront capital cost, so that it's distributed over time. So this is where innovative financing models, but also government policy that helps poorer communities or families to put up solar and wind is really important. And so we need to think about how do we bridge that gap for those that can't afford that upfront capital cost. So I think it's a really important concern in how we think about making renewable energy accessible to everybody.
You talk renewable energy versus obviously fossil fuels. What's going to happen to that industry, which is a massive industry? We're talking coal, etc. We're talking hundreds and thousands of job losses. Where do people move on from there?
Right. And I think this is one of the central concerns for acting on climate change. And it brings up big questions about justice and fairness in that transition. And for an organization like 350 Africa and for myself, making it what we call a just transition is central to acting on climate change in the right way, in the fair way. And so what we're seeing in other countries is they're putting in place just transition plans which help workers to transition out of the coal sector, out of the oil and gas sector, because we don't want to demonize the workers. They've played a very important role in providing us with energy in the past, so we don't want to leave them behind as we transition to the future. And so the sort of slogan is leave no one behind as you do this transition. And so you need upskilling programs, you need social security for these workers so that their pension funds and healthcare benefits aren't left behind as we do this transition. Now I think there's a challenge in the South African space where you see many of, for instance, the coal industry workers are concentrated in Mpumalanga and Limpopo, and it's not necessarily the case that renewable energy will be situated in the exact same spaces, right? So there's a geographical disparity that we need to address as we make those plans. And so this is where the role of the national government in implementing a just transition plan is vital, because we need to ensure that we're providing opportunities and moving coal workers into this renewable energy sector. In the long run, renewable energy, so speaking to the question of employment, is going to be a much bigger employer than if we stayed with fossil fuels. But we need to make sure.
Give us examples.
So if you look, there's studies that are basically done showing that if you're building solar and wind, you're creating 3 to 5 times more jobs than if you're building coal, oil, and gas. And you know, it doesn't seem like it when you look at just like one small wind turbine out in the wilderness or a solar plant. It doesn't look like there's that many people working on it, but you need to think about the scale of things, right? Because one wind turbine only produces a few megawatts, right? Whereas a big coal plant will produce hundreds, right? And so even though you only have a few people working on each wind turbine or solar plant, when you add them up, it actually adds up to a lot more. So you have larger employment, but at the same time, just because there's bigger employment, that doesn't mean we can forget about the workers that will be left behind in the fossil fuel industry if we don't put in place policies to help them. Right?
And I should imagine there'll be a phased out approach as far as that is concerned, fossil fuel workers, because there has to be a strategy in place. Otherwise, we'll be in huge trouble here in South Africa or elsewhere in the world. Let's go for an ad break. When we come back, we'll talk some more to you about climate change. Alex Linferna is in studio. He's from an organization called 350.org. We're talking climate change. What is happening in other parts of the world? How far is South Africa lagging behind? What do we do to catch up as far as climate change is concerned? We're looking at climate change in this part of the program. Alex Linferna is my guest. He's with an organization called 350.org. You're global, or you're not? 350.org.
Yes, we have an African regional group and a South Africa team, but we have global groupings of people across every continent in the world except for Antarctica. And we're very much grassroots, people-driven movement. How
do we as South Africa compare with the rest of the world as far as making strides in climate change issues is concerned?
There was an organization, well, there is an organization called Climate Action Tracker. And what they do is they try to rank the different countries according to what promises they've made on their action on climate change. And when they ranked South Africa, unfortunately, we're pretty poor in our performance. They called us highly insufficient, right? And if everybody followed our example, we'd be heading to a world of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That doesn't sound too bad, but the aim that we're actually globally supposed to be aiming for is 1.5 degrees Celsius, and a world of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius is a truly devastating, catastrophic climate change future with meters of sea level rise, with hundreds of millions of people displaced by climate change, with increased poverty and hunger. So South Africa is really poorly ranked, and we're also ranked by the World Economic Forum in terms of our progress transitioning from our energy systems to a sort of a clean energy and reliable energy system. We're ranked 114th out of 115 in the world.
Ooh.
Only Haiti is doing worse than us, so we're really, really far behind. But we have the potential to do so much better. We have renewable energy resources, sun and wind in South Africa, which we could tap into. And so the opportunities are there.
Are the powers that be take you guys seriously enough? Do you have a loud enough voice?
I would say no. If you look at the past elections, climate change, it was there, it was a footnote, it was in the manifestos, but it wasn't a central element of our elections, right? And so that was one way of determining whether this was really a priority for us. So I think the powers that be are starting to think about it, but when experts across the world are telling us this is one of the gravest threats facing global society, our politicians are not responding proportionate to that. And so I think there needs to be more momentum building, more people power put onto politicians so that they do take this seriously.
How do the ordinary man in the street support you guys to get this very strong message across?
So I think there's a number of ways of doing it. One is, of course, to get out and be in the streets and rally when there are actions around climate change. But, not everybody's out there in the streets, so that's totally understandable. You can speak to your politicians, tell them this is where you want action to be had. You can act in your local community. You can write letters to the newspaper as well talking about this. But there's also, we form community groups across the country where people come together and they organize around climate change action. And so that's a big part of our model, is getting people together, building community power so that we can raise our voices collectively to put pressure on politicians.
In the UK and in Australia and other parts of the world, there's a huge push to try and clean up the oceans of all the litter and very especially plastics. How does that impact on what we're talking about?
So I think what we face globally is a very much interconnected ecological problems, and plastic pollution is a major problem facing our oceans. It's choking the wildlife there, it's then feeding back into us, and it's also connected to climate change insofar as the production of plastics actually is a large contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. There was a study that came out just last week, I think, actually, that said that plastic production is on track to emit as much greenhouse gases as something like, don't quote me on this particular number, something like 500 coal power plants. That's how much greenhouse gas emissions are made in the production of plastic. So reducing our sort of like wasteful plastic use is a key part of addressing climate change. But also in terms of ensuring that we're not filling our waterways with harmful plastics, which are not only harming animals and wildlife, but come back to harm us in the long run.
And also there's another huge problem about getting rid of the plastic. I think the world has run out of dump sites. They used to dump in the poorer countries, in the third world countries, and I think third world countries are also waking up and saying no, even though they were getting paid premium for being, getting the plastic and all the rubbish dumped in their, on their lands, but they're waking up to that hazard as well. That being said, do you foresee perhaps sometime in the future a world without plastic? And if you do, what would be the alternative? Because let's face it, we found plastic very useful.
Yeah, so I think there's a number of important things there. One is that, of course, our waste often does impact the poorer communities the most, and so
because it's not biodegradable, unfortunately.
No, the plastics that we create last thousands of years, right, or hundreds of years, and so there's these real big issues, and this is central to a lot of our climate and environmental analysis, is this question of justice, because most of our impacts are falling on the poorest and most marginalized. So I think that needs to be central to our thinking about why we need to address this. In terms of moving away from plastic, I think you're right. Plastic has played an incredibly valuable role in many applications, whether it's plastic bags or, we're looking at the camera that's made a lot out of plastic. So I don't think it's necessary to move away from plastics altogether, but it is to think about alternatives where we can. and to think about a lot of the wasteful ways that we use plastic, single-use plastics, whether it's in our shopping bags, and the way that we wrap our food. There's just plastic everywhere, right? And there are alternatives that are emerging to plastics, plant-based alternatives which can be there, but there's often the reduce, reuse, and recycle, right? And recycle is kind of the last one that you want. You want to try reduce is the most, so use less of plastics if you can, and then reuse in order to, that's the second best, and then recycling comes third, I suppose. So how do we reduce, I think, is the biggest question that we face, and there are alternatives out there, and we can do things like changing our own individual habits, but I think it also falls on the government and on the big companies to change their practices. And you've seen in other countries where they've implemented plastic bag bans and things like that, where actually the government and companies are taking the lead, so it doesn't just fall on consumers, because often we're told we are the ones who have to change our habits, and we play a certain role.
But I think collectively we do play a huge role. We as single consumers collectively make up huge numbers, so we do need to play our part as well.
Right.
Let's just wrap up the discussion on climate change, and you spoke about rising sea levels. The rising sea levels is taking back land, which means people have to be relocated. That's a huge impact on infrastructure and on governments as well. What other impacts are we seeing? Are the winters getting colder and the summers hotter? How does that affect us as human beings?
So I think we're seeing so many different impacts. We're seeing rising sea levels, as you said, but what we've seen is flooding in KwaZulu-Natal. That can be linked to climate change.
And just onto the issue of rising sea levels, the temperature of the water is also rising, and that has a direct impact on sea life, does it not?
It does, yeah. So as the water gets warmer, not only does it expand and then contributes to more rising seas, but things like coral reefs, for instance, are sensitive to temperatures, and so if it gets very hot, coral reefs go through a process called bleaching, where they basically expel the plants that help keep them alive, right? And as a result of that, we could see, if we don't act rapidly on climate change, all tropical coral reefs pretty much going extinct by the middle of the century, that soon, right? And it has impacts on fish migrations and where fish go. And it's projected to actually move fish populations from the equator further north. And so a lot of communities that are very reliant on fish may be negatively impacted. So the warming of the waters has a big impact in ways that are often very difficult to predict. And there's just a host of climate change impacts. I think we don't fully realize how interconnected our human civilization is to a stable climate, whether it's our ability to predictably grow food, right? And that's huge. If food prices go up, which is predicted to happen as climate change occurs, that affects the political stability of a country. We've talked about this before, is how the Arab Spring was partly predicated by a rise in food prices, which led to significant political instability. Of course, there was a range of other factors going on at the same time, but that sort of climate factor seemed to play one pivotal role. And so what we can see moving forward is, as climate change impacts so many different elements of our economy, whether it's food security, water availability, stability of the places that we live, that this is a multifaceted crisis that we could face and that we're already beginning to face. So it's just a question of how bad are we going to let it get, and whether we turn around in time to avoid some of the worst impacts.
We've almost come to the end of the show. What do we do to support 350.org, and what is your future vision?
So 350.org welcomes people to join our movement. We're people-powered, and so feel free to jump on our website. 350africa.org will be our specific regional one, and you can sign up on our mailing list and get involved. We've got actions coming up. Actually, this Friday, Africa Day, we've got over 60 actions across Africa, where communities are rising up and saying no to fossil fuels and yes to a prosperous and equitable renewable energy future. Youth Day, we're going to be mobilizing youth to demand climate justice, because they're the ones that are going to be left dealing with this climate crisis if we don't act. And so we're mobilizing youth across the country to act on that. And our vision for the long term is to move South Africa and the world to a 100% renewable energy future. But to get there, paying very close attention and ensuring we're making it a just transition, so we're not leaving people behind. and so that we're giving everybody equitable access to energy and opportunity as we do that.
And good on you and 350.org. Thank you indeed for raising the flag on this issue. We will be watching you closely. Keep up the great work. Thank you and go well. That was Alex Lenferner from 350.org talking climate change, and that's where we wrap up for today. Thank you indeed for your company. Hope you've enjoyed the show as much as we've enjoyed your company. A big thank you to the production team. And till the next time, as always, it is Assalamu alaikum and Khuda Hafiz from me, Julie Alli.
قلبي على جمعة الخير هلا حن قلبي على جمعة الخير هلا يا هلا ويا هلا ويا هلا ويا هلا يا هلا ويا هلا ويا هلا ويا هلا ويا